evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to tonight's parent workshop, Positive Discipline, taught by Candace Lund Bollinger. My name is Sarah Smith. I work in the communications office at Tumwater School District office. Just a few items to touch on before we start tonight's class. The packet of notes that was emailed out to you for this evening, there was one extra document called Developmental Responses to Divorce. Please disregard that document was added accidentally. Also for tonight, we ask that you do not record the class yourself due to confidentiality for others in the class. We will post tonight's class on the TSD website if you would like to rewatch it. And for no further ado, we have Miss Candace. And if there's anything you'd like to say before we get started.
Okay, so one thing I would want to be sure, you guys, is that you remember that you can interrupt me at any time. So if you have a question about something or a comment, just unmute yourselves and ask, and then you can remute after we talk. So are we ready to go? All right. So
Ready to go.
So Sarah, did you tell them about posting questions too, and that you'll field those?
Oh, no. You can go ahead and also post questions into the chat. I'll be watching, and then I can try to incorporate a question in between a good pause for Candace.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we're talking about tonight is positive discipline. And I think the hardest thing about being a good disciplinarian is actually undoing old belief systems that we have in our heads about discipline that came from either the model we had growing up or something we've read or that really gets in the way of being an effective disciplinarian. And we've had so much brain research in the last 15, 20 years that we have a lot of good information about how brain works and what works for discipline. So I want to start with just having some general information, and you don't have a copy of this. It was the one that didn't come in place of the one that accidentally came. And so there's some things in general I want to talk about first. The first is that I think the biggest thing that is really important for people to shift in their brains when you start thinking about discipline is that literally discipline means to teach. And for most of us, we grew up with the model of, and sometimes even verbally spoken of, discipline meant to punish. And so I think to make that shift in your head of good discipline is teaching. It's about teaching. It's not about punishing. And what we know is, in fact, now that our parents didn't know, was that if you are using punishment, then chances are anytime you're in pain or shame or fear, you learn slower and you learn less. And so punishment as a form of teaching, we now know undermines the effectiveness. So number one, discipline means to teach, and you don't want to use punishment because it actually makes it slower and less likely to work. Now, the other piece is I want you to really think about it in terms of controlling behavior, because many of us grew up in authoritarian families. And authoritarian families, the belief was that if you're the adult, you have the power, you are in charge, so it's very much about control. And what we know about controlling behavior in terms of discipline is that it creates a natural response to resist it. And so we know that when we use controlling techniques as a way of teaching, that we actually also cut off our noses because we end up getting more resistance than we would if we used other methods. So knowing now that discipline literally means to teach, and that using punishment or controlling behavior is actually going to make you less effective, then the question becomes, well, what do you use? Because for most people, what they saw their parents use, if they didn't use techniques like being physical, spanking, hitting, threatening, shaming, all of those things that our parents used, often used, or and were taught to use, in all fairness, now knowing that those are not the tools that are going to work and are in fact going to sabotage our effectiveness, then we have to replace them with something. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight, is replacing them. With that said, though, I want to go back and talk a little bit about authoritarian, because many of us who came from an authoritarian style of parenting were really clear we did not want that style of parenting ourselves with our children, because we didn't like how it made us feel. We felt like it was not respectful, with all these different reasons why we didn't want to be authoritarian parents. As that happened, we didn't know how to shift away from being authoritarian into authoritative. And so I want to be really clear that it is important still to maintain authority, not be authoritarian, not do the because I said so, because I'm bigger, because you're going to be hurt by me if you don't. But with authority means, when you talk about authority, the difference is that you're really clear that authority has to do with wisdom, and that you in fact do have way more wisdom and always will than your children. No matter what age they are, you have authority because you will have had more life experience and more wisdom. So you still have to understand and believe that you have the authority, that they are not your equals in making decisions or your equals in assessing situations, that you will have authority without being authoritarian. So I know that's a little bit of an abstract concept. Does anybody have any questions before I move on from that? Okay. So sometimes people will, and I just coming back to authoritative versus authoritarian, sometimes people will say to me, well, I don't know how to do that. I don't understand how I would do that. And by even asking that question, I know people aren't being authoritative, because they are not understanding that they don't have to do anything other than to believe that your children don't have the same life experience, and therefore your decision making and your approaches to issues are always going to have more leverage. And so if they act like they don't feel confident, and if you're acting like you're not confident about what you're teaching, your kids will pick that up. And that's where people will say, well, I don't think I do have authority with my kids. It's probably because they've picked up their hesitancy to be authoritarian, but have then not seen you replace it with a sense of confidence about your own wisdom and life experience. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is talk about normal development. One of the things that has to go hand in hand with discipline is you have to stay in tune with where your kids are developmentally. So, for example, tonight we're going to be talking about grade school age discipline, at grade school and younger discipline. And when your kids are in middle school, you will be using different tools, because there will be different development and different goals to be teaching. When they're in high school, they'll be in a different developmental stage. There'll be different goals. You'll be using different tools when they're in high school. And one of the things I'll see when I'm working with parents one-on-one in counseling is that they will be frustrated because they don't seem to be getting the results they want from their middle or high school student. And I'll be talking to them about, what they're using to teach, and they'll be using the same techniques that they may have heard me speak about in preschool or in grade school. And I'll say, the problem here is that you are one, teaching to a different developmental stage, and you don't have the tools to be teaching to that stage or the clarity of what you're trying to teach at that age. So just keep in mind that you have to really be sure you know where your kids are developmentally. Now, with that, the other piece of this that's so important is that a behavior that's developmental, and you know that that behavior is normal for that developmental stage, you react differently to it. If you think a behavior is abnormal, we all as human beings react to abnormal. Whereas if you know a behavior is normal, you respond ideally to it. You're still going to intervene. You're still going to teach to it, but you're going to teach from that place of not being anxious or fearful because you see it's abnormal. You're going to say, ah, that's normal 7-year-old behavior. I still want to work with this tool about it, but I don't have to be freaked out and reactive because I know it's normal for that age. So anytime we can normalize behavior, we're going to be less reactive. So again, we want to be sure that you are doing, with discipline, you're doing hand in hand your consciousness about where your kids are developmentally. Now, the other thing is the urgency piece. Speaking of development, one of the things we grew up with in our authoritarian style of parenting was literally learning and hearing the words of urgency around discipline. We literally heard things like, well, you've got to nip that in the bud right now. Whoa, if they're, what are they going to be like at 16 if they're doing that at 3? It's like all of this urgency about discipline. And that's because back in the generation where your parents were parenting, or at least your grandparents, they didn't have the brain research we have now, where we literally know you don't have an adult brain until you are 25 years old. So there is an urgency in this process. And when you're urgent about a process, you're more likely to be reactive again. And so if you're reactive, you're going to use reactive tools that are probably going to be causing pain, shame, or fear. And if you're causing shame, pain, or fear because you're reacting, your kids are going to learn slower and they're going to learn less. So I want to remind you that if you have even the high end of this age group, which would be 10 or 11, you still have another 14, 15 years before your kids have an adult brain. So you have no urgency in this process. You have years and years and years of teaching so that you aren't having to worry about what they're doing at 3. What they're acting like at 3 is nothing like they're going to be at 16. So I really want people to be conscious about not buying into that urgency. Even when children will launch from your home at 18, they're still going to have 7 more years of brain development. So that's why, people don't even think about this, but it's why I have a class of parenting 18 to 25, because you're still going to be parenting. If they're in your home or not, you're still going to be teaching in those last 7 years, and you're going to be teaching differently and with different goals, but they still will not have an adult brain until 25. So questions about urgency. Okay. The next thing is you will be ever, ever, ever respectful. And again, one of the things that we saw in authoritarian parenting was using disrespect almost as a tool. We used it to shame or to impose embarrassment or fear. And so we have all of that really entrenched in us. One of the hardest things is really having all these entrenched belief systems and getting rid of them over time so that we can replace them with more effective tools. And so just keeping in mind that you will try to be ever, ever respectful, your tone of voice, your body language, things like rolling your eyes, huffing, sneering, all of those are disrespectful behaviors. Putting kids down as a way of making them have less power and authority. So all these little things that we don't even know we carry with us as things that we use thinking we're teaching, we have to learn to use other tools so that we are not being disrespectful. Okay. And then the last thing I want to talk about is that whole piece about not using fear as a driver. So that what we'll see is even if people get lots of good information about discipline early on, for example, in infant and toddler classes, they, as their kids get older, they will find themselves slipping back into using some of the old style of parenting that is authoritarian, like being more punitive, being more shaming. And part of the reason for that is that as we have our fear triggered, we aren't as intentional, or our ability to be intentional gets diminished. And so we go back to using those old tools because we are triggered, we get more scared. So we still don't see a lot of fear in grade school. And so people will oftentimes do a really good job of disciplining even through grade school. But as their kids get into middle school and high school, and the consequences of your kids' behavior gets greater, for example, with alcohol and drugs or driving or sexuality or pregnancy, it's like then we're more vulnerable to slipping back into being more punitive again and causing pain and fear because we're fearful. With that said, it's like you've got to keep reminding yourself that if you use those techniques, you're actually cutting off your own nose at a time when you're most fearful. So our goal is to try to get as many of the positive discipline techniques that don't cause pain and fear really integrated into your brain before you get to those developmental ages where you're likely to be triggered and go back to old styles of that you grew up with of discipline. Okay, so that's just general information. Anybody have any questions about that or comments?
The chat is clear right now.
Okay. All right. So you have two sheets that I want you to grab right now. One says positive discipline options. If you can have them side by side or somehow pull them up on your screens where you have qualities we want our children to have and positive discipline options side by side, that would be good because I really want people to understand how teaching works in terms of getting the outcomes we want for the adults we want to be raising. So what happens is that many people start disciplining without what I call a clear map of where they're trying to go with their discipline. It's like if you don't even know what you want your kids to be learning, it's hard to know what tools to use to teach it. So that's where the qualities we want when our children are adults come in. I just made a list of several different characteristics that most people would probably want their children to have when they're 25 years old, because I want people to be able to have a map to think about, okay, what am I trying to teach here? And if I'm trying to teach someone to be compassionate, then I have to use a tool that models compassion. Otherwise, I've just undermined compassionate If I don't use a tool that's compassionate, I'm going to undermine my kids' learning compassion when they make a mistake. So we not only have to be careful about what we're teaching intentionally, we have to be careful about what we're teaching unintentionally. And as we play with this tonight, I'll give you some examples of how we end up teaching a characteristic on this map that we didn't intend to teach. Okay, so let's start with choices. So every technique we use has a purpose to it and teaches different characteristics off this map. When we're teaching choices, what I want you to remember about choices is that you should never be giving more than 2, maybe 3 choices at one time. And that the choices you're giving need to all be okay with you, and that you determine the choices. It's not that your kids should come up with 3 choices and you accept one. You make the choices, no more than 2 or 3, and they have to be acceptable to you. Now, under the age of 7, what we know is that kids will almost always pick the last thing you say. So if you have a preference, you should probably say it last. If your kids are under or over 7 or over, that's not likely to happen. Then the choices are really considered by them. So if you have someone younger than 7 and you would prefer they wear their blue shoes, you would say, do you want to wear your red shoes or your blue shoes? And you've got a really good chance of getting the blue shoes. After that, you really have to be sure you're going to be okay with that, whatever choice you give them. Now, with that said, as we were moving away from being authoritarian, parents went heavily into giving choices, especially as toddlers, which was fairly appropriate because you were dealing with learning how to manage power, but not appropriate in the sense that parents used it so much that they lost a lot of authority, and a lot of our kids believed they had a right to get a choice about everything, which meant they got way too much power. So you have to learn not to use choices inappropriately or too much. But one of the things that I want to be clear about with choices is that they teach some really powerful things in terms of things on your map. So now look at your map. What kinds of things do your kids learn by giving them choices? They learn assertiveness. They learn how to authentically pick what they like. They learn how to be collaborative. They learn to be more confident. They learn to be critical thinkers. They learn to be more, let's see, another really common one down here. Possibly happy, possibly honest, possibly having integrity, doing, what's really authentic, possibly optimism. So it's not like you're just giving choices because it's an easy out. You're giving choices because there are characteristics you want your children to develop in these next 10 years or so, these first 10 years, that come with giving choices. So questions about choices. Oh, one of the things I started to say is that sometimes people will give choices not intending to honor them. They use them because they want to have a more what seems respectful approach. So they'll say things like, are you ready for bed now? That's a choice. Is everybody clear? When you say, are you ready for bed? That's a choice of, are you ready or are you not ready for bed? So if your child says, no, I don't want to go to bed now, you don't say, well, you have to go to bed now. Then it wasn't a choice. And they didn't learn all these things. What they learned is that they really don't get any power when they're given a choice, which is not what you want to teach on that map. So if you make the mistake of giving a choice when you didn't mean to, you still honor the choice. So you would say, are you ready for it? Do you want to go to bed now? And they'd say, no, I don't want to go to bed. And you'd say, okay, I'll set the timer for 5 minutes and then it's time for bed. Then it's a statement. It's time for bed. So you can save face by just then honoring the choice, but resetting the stage to have your authority back. Okay. So questions about choices before we move on. And kids should not be given choices fall under collaborative. And we shouldn't be collaborating with our children more than a quarter of the time. So if you're giving choices more than a quarter of the time, you're actually giving your kids too much power and authority, if that's helpful to sort of assess where you belong. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk about is making amends. This one is fascinating to me because most of us grew up never seeing making amends. For most of us, and I talk about this from a counseling perspective, for many, many adults, one of the biggest problems they have in interpersonal relationships, particularly partnerships, is they don't know how to make amends and never had it modeled. And if there's any technique that has the greatest impact on how many of the characteristics your kids learn off their map, it would be making amends. And sadly enough, we don't teach it or model it, probably because we didn't see it or see it used as a technique growing up. So number one, put a little note to yourself, making amends is not saying you're sorry. Because it is one thing we did see is we saw our parents say you're sorry, say you're sorry. And so it actually taught something very different. It taught being inauthentic. It taught, um, which is really gross. I'll be in an adult counseling session and I'll hear a partner say to another partner, I told you I was sorry. And I'm like, whoa, that is so not sorry. That is not authentic. It's not respectful. It's not making amends. So be clear that saying you're sorry is acknowledging you have amends to make. You say that again. It's fine to say you're sorry, but saying you're sorry is not making amends. Saying you're sorry is acknowledging you need to make amends. So making amends has to do with taking action. It means that you acknowledge, one, that you need to make amends. It means taking an action to repair the damage you did, either physically or emotionally. So it's an action of repair, and it's an action of change is the third step. So you acknowledge you need to make amends. You do something to repair the relationship. And then the third step is you take the time to think about what you need to change yourself to not do that a violation again. All of you know that you can hear sorry, sorry, sorry only so many times. And then it's like, I don't care if you're sorry, stop doing it. And so we want our kids to learn to be able to recognize they have violated someone or hurt someone or broken something. We want them to know how to repair that so that it doesn't erode away a relationship. And we want them to step back and be able to assess what they could do to not continue that behavior again. So making amends would look like with your child, because you're going to be modeling this like crazy, because modeling is going to be one of the really important ways of teaching. And you're going to model make amends. You're going to say, I'm really sorry I yelled at you this morning getting ready for school. You will go in and maybe give them a hug or bring them a cup of tea or something that will repair the pain you caused. And then ideally you would say, listen, I'm going to start getting up a half hour earlier because I think if I'm not so rushed, I won't get as angry about getting out the door. So you've acknowledged you've caused a violation. You've tried to repair the violation, and you've said, I'm making this change so I don't continue to violate you in the same way. Those are the 3 steps of making amends. Now, if you look at qualities you want your children to have when they're 25 years old, you can almost use every one of these. You would be being authentic, you would be centered, you'd be communicative, you'd be compassionate, you'd be considerate, courteous, creative, because you have to think of how to make amends. You would be a critical thinker, thinking about how you were going to keep from making that again. You would be emotionally intelligent, empathic, generous, helpful, honest, independent, show integrity, be kind, be loving, be open-minded and optimistic. You would be resourceful, you would be respectful, you would be self-aware, you'd be self-assessing, you would be self-directed, you would be self-respectful, you would have sometimes a sense of humor, you would be thoughtful. Almost every characteristic you would like your 25-year-old to have would be learned by making amends, and it's a tool we rarely use. Okay, so questions about making amends.
Chat is clear.
Okay, all right, the third one we're going to talk about is logical consequences. One of the things I want you to write in here right away is that kids do not predict consequences until somewhere between 7 and 8 years old. So under the age of 7, they can learn consequences, but they can't predict them. And so if you have a 5-year-old that you're wrestling with on the floor and they stand up and jump on your stomach, and you say, like, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? They're going to say, I don't know. Or they're going to say, it was an accident. And you're thinking, no, I watched you purposely jump on my stomach. When they say it's an accident or I don't know, they aren't lying to you. They can't predict consequences. They knew they were jumping. They did not predict how much it would hurt you. Now, if they did it once and it hurt you like that, if they did it again, that would be not acceptable because they can learn a consequence. They just can't predict a consequence. So because they can't predict consequences, we have to be sure that we're really careful about using logical consequences, not just consequences. They have to be logical so that they can learn. By the time they're somewhere between 7 and 8, they can learn that their behavior is predictable in its outcome. So we want to be sure that our consequences are logical so that they learn how to predict them when they do turn 7 or 8, and then make decisions based on that logic that they can assess. So a logical consequence, number 1, needs to be related to the behavior. It needs to always be related to the behavior. It needs to be respectful, always. And ideally revealed in advance, but we can't always reveal them in advance. So let me say it again. The 3 R's of a logical consequence are related to the behavior, respectful, ideally revealed in advance. So if your child, for example, throws a ball in the house, you would say, if you throw that ball again in the house, you will lose the ball or lose it for the day or whatever it might be. And that's related to the behavior because you don't want them destroying furniture or whatever. So it's related to the behavior. It's respectful, and it's revealed in advance. So the next time they throw the ball, you don't have to warn them again. You just take the ball away for however long you said. The logical consequence for a child not getting into their car seat is they, number one, can't go, or if you have to go, you put them in the car seat. That's the logical consequence. The logical consequence for, I'm trying to think of another really common one. The logical consequence for a child who isn't getting ready in the morning is that they will be late for school and they'll have to go in and get their pink slip. That's a logical consequence. A logical consequence for a 10-year-old who doesn't get her dirty clothes into the dirty clothes hamper might be that she doesn't have a pair of pants that she wanted to wear to school that next day. Now, this is really important. When I say how important it is to be related to the behavior, the second one is interesting. We're always respectful. This is so fascinating because we grew up with some of our parents being very conscious about using logical consequences, but they used them incredibly punitively. And so we grew up thinking logical consequences were punishment. And then we go ahead and we use them like punishment, which then makes them less effective. So let me give you an example. Your 10-year-old who didn't get their pants into the dirty clothes hamper in time to be washed, most parents have in the past, ideally not now, would have said, well, you're just going to have to wear them dirty, aren't you? Or I guess you're not going to have them for school because you didn't get them in there, did you? We get snide, we get really disrespectful, we get shaming, thinking because we grew up with that that's how they're going to learn to do it. But if you remember back, it didn't teach you to do it sooner or better. What it taught you was that your parent, whoever that parent was that talked to you that way, was really an asshole. And under your breath, you were like, they are such assholes because they did that. They weren't focused on changing or learning the behavior. You were focused on the relationship. There's a reason for you to be ever respectful. And people will say, well, then what is the logical consequence? The logical consequence wasn't the problem. It was the disrespect in the logical consequence that was the problem. So you would say, listen, babe, you know what? You didn't get your clothes in and I've already done a load. So, hun, you can either wash those out by hand or you're going to have to wear something else tomorrow until I get the next load done on Saturday. Same consequence, absolutely the same consequence, but you delivered it respectfully. And you also demonstrated some compassion. You could have started with, hey, babe, don't you hate it when you forget to get your clothes in the dirty clothes? Well, honey, you're either going to have to wash it out by hand or you're going to have to wear something else. Same learning, it's the same tool. It's a logical consequence, but you were respectful and compassionate. What you learned off this map from that is entirely different than what you would learn if someone was using illogical or disrespectful presentation of a logical consequence. Reason we worry about logical consequences being used too much is they are usually delivered punitively, disrespectfully. And so what kids learn is making a mistake is shameful. So all of a sudden what drops off here is creativity and self-esteem. And what goes on this map that people are always shocked about and say, I don't know why they're such perfectionists. They're such perfectionists because we taught them to be perfectionists. We shamed them for making a mistake. So if we don't want our kids to be perfectionists, then you have to be compassionate when they make a mistake. Don't you hate it, babe, when you forget to put your dirty clothes in the dirty clothes hamper? You've taught compassion. You've normalized the humanity of making a mistake. And then you still want to teach. So you say, you know what? You can either wash it out by hand or you have to wear something else on until I wash again. Okay. So, questions about logical consequences, questions about how to use a logical consequence. Now, in the first 5, 6, 7 years, I do encourage people to use a lot of logical consequencing if they do it right, because I'm really wanting kids between under that age of 7 before they start predicting consequences to really have that good backdrop, that good modeling of how to predict a consequence, so that ideally they don't ever need to be or have discipline because they will have thought about their behavior and possibly change the behavior so there isn't something negative that happens. So, but after age 8, I don't want people so focused on logical consequences because it does undermine creativity. It does undermine compassion. It does stay focused on making mistakes. And so after age 8, you're still going to use logical consequences after as one of your tools. But as time goes on, you're going to be using other tools so that you aren't so heavily weighted on that and then knock some of those good things off your map, like creativity, self-confidence, self-directed, all those self things on there, self-directed, self-aware, self-assessing, self-disciplined. All of that drops off if you get too heavily focused on logical consequences. Okay, so questions about logical consequences. One of the things I'll oftentimes hear parents say is that I didn't really grow up with logical consequences. And so my problem is I can't think of them fast enough to use them. Or, what would be related to the behavior for this or for that behavior, and still be respectful. And so I want to remind you, if you have kids who are older than 4, you don't need to have that immediate thought about what a good logical consequence would be for teaching. You can say, take your time. You can say, let me think about what a logical consequence is for this. It really shows some really good teaching tools when you say that. By saying, let me go think about that, it shows you that it's important to be intentional. It shows that you are really thoughtful. It shows that you are trying to be really respectful about and conscious of what you're teaching. Those are all things you want your kids to be able to do as they turn 25 years old. So you can say, let me think about that, and I'll come back to talk to you about what the consequence of that behavior is. And then take your time and really think about what is it that I'm trying to teach and what would that consequence look like. Okay, and still be respectful. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about reinforcement. So in about the 70s, maybe even as early as the 60s, we started to see a lot of reinforcement used. People were starting to be conscious of not wanting to be as authoritarian, as punitive in their discipline as they grew up with. And so they were thinking, well, how do we then get the behaviors we want? And we'd done enough experimentation by then that we knew that reinforcing a behavior would sometimes cause a behavior to be repeated. So we thought, okay, we'll do a lot of reinforcement, and reinforcement could look like giving them rewards, or it could look like giving them lots of praise, or all of which, and that's why it's still on this list, all of which I think are good. I don't want you to take off reinforcement entirely off this list. But what we did learn is that when we use so much praise and so much reward, what we did was we lost some really important characteristics off this map. What we saw is that we created what we call really externally contexted people. And by externally contexted people, I mean that they only did something if they got a reward for it, if they got praise for it. And so it did work in some ways, but at an incredible cost, because what dropped off was being authentic. What dropped off was being self-directed, being self-disciplined, being self-reliant, being self-respectful, being self-aware. All of those self skills were diminished because we were so externally contexted. And so what we learned is we had to step back from doing so much of that reward and praise and use other techniques so that we didn't undermine characteristics that we desperately wanted to see in our 25-year-olds and older, that we were seeing suddenly weren't there, that they didn't have those characteristics or tools. And that was because we overused a positive discipline technique. So even though a technique may be a positive tool, overuse of it without being intentional can actually undermine what we get as an outcome for our adult children. Okay, so questions about reinforcement and praise. So yes, you still want to use them. If they're really young, when kids are young, it's important to be sure that it's immediate. It's important to be sure that it's something they really want. It's pretty hard to reinforce a behavior with carrot sticks. For example, it's like that's just like not likely going to be something that's going to reinforce the behavior. So needs to be something they want, ideally fairly quickly around the behavior. And again, always respectful. And ideally for a very specific behavior. I'll sometimes see parents generalize, especially with young children, ineffectively, where they'll say, if you're nice at the grocery store, you'll get a treat. But they aren't specific about what the behavior is they're looking for. So it's like, if you stay with me and don't run around, if you don't take things off the shelves, if you aren't too loud, if you aren't baying for treats, it's like, be specific about what nice is before you decide to reinforce a behavior. Okay, so questions about reinforcement.
The chat is clear.
Okay, so focus time and emotional rapport. So one of the things that we did learn through the generations of authoritarian parenting was that there was an incredible cost to that style. It may have looked like kids behaved, it may have looked like good behavior, but it also really horribly undermined the adult-child relationship, their rapport, their connection. Many people didn't want relationship by the time they were teenagers with their parents. They didn't want a thing to do with them. And they also, by the time they were by the time they were teenagers, they weren't afraid in the same way of adults. So all that fear that they used to control behavior when they were younger would no longer work. So what I want people clear about is, if you don't have a strong connection with your child, you don't have any power once your kids turn 11, 12 or older. Your power lies in keeping your connection, your rapport with them. And so we have to constantly be thinking about what are the tools we can use that will still help us maintain the rapport, keep our authority, and teach our children what we want them to know by the time they're 25 years old. So that's why we started shifting over to what we call more positive discipline techniques, because we learned that you could teach the same behavior and probably more effectively than punishing, and that we could maintain the relationship that would keep them open to us still teaching them. Because we don't want to lose the ability to teach in the years when we are most fearful about what they need to learn. So, little note to yourself. You're always going to keep your finger on the pulse of your rapport with your child. If you notice that you're yelling more, if you notice that you're not getting eye contact, if you notice that you're not enjoying your kids, if you notice that you're not talking much anymore, if you notice that you're not laughing much, if you notice that your discipline techniques aren't working, even though you're using good tools, then probably your rapport is faltering. And there's all kinds of reasons for rapport to falter. It can falter because there's been changes in your environment. A new baby came into the household. It could be that you moved. It could be that there's been a divorce. It could be that someone's been chronically ill, or just temporarily sick, you or your child. It could be there's certain developmental stages where it's way harder to have rapport. It's harder at 7 to have rapport. It's harder at 3 to have rapport. It's very hard at 9 to have rapport. It's hard at 11 and 13 to have rapport. So just development can affect rapport. But if your rapport is faltering, then step back from the teaching a little bit. Work on re-establishing rapport, then go back to teaching. The fastest and the best way to re-establish rapport is to spend 20 to 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week, one-on-one. It's hard to do rapport in a group. One-on-one, doing something no fail fun. So let me say this again. 20 to 30 minutes, one-on-one, 2 to 3 times a week, doing something no fail fun. Now, people who have 3 or 4 kids will say, how would I ever do that one-on-one? You don't always have your rapport faltering with all the kids at all the same time. So you're only doing this if you notice one child is just not really connecting, or you're really struggling with them. You're going to work on rapport with that child for a couple weeks. Maybe a week or 2 later, it's another child you're going to be working with rapport on. So it's not like you have to do this with every child all the time. It's when you notice that your rapport is faltering that you be like, aha, I've really got to sort of get this back in place so I'm effective again. So when I say no fail fun, what I mean by that is it has to be something you can do for 20 or 30 minutes that you can guarantee will stay fun. So I don't, for example, encourage people to play games as a way for 20 or 30 minutes with a 4-year-old, because 4-year-olds are really competitive. If they lose, it is not no fail fun. So either you be prepared to be sure you never win with a 4-year-old, or you don't play a game with a 4-year-old, because it's not going to be a rapport builder. With a teenager, sometimes people will say to me, well, the only thing they want to do is they'll go to a movie with me or watch a TV show with me, and I'll go, perfect. It's 20 to 30 minutes of no fail fun. Sometimes if you try to go, and they'll say, well, they don't even talk to me. I'm like, perfect. If you talked, it probably wouldn't be no fail fun. So you have to think where your kids are and what they would be doing that would be no fail fun for both of you for 20 to 30 minutes. Now, the 20 to 30 minutes is also really important. People will say, well, I took my child, we really were struggling. So I took him to Seattle, went to the circus. I took him out to dinner. We walked around the waterfront, and they were just absolutely jerks on the way home. And I'm like, there's a reason I say 20 to 30 minutes of no fail fun. That's how long you can maintain no fail fun, 20 to 30 minutes. And then something's going to happen that's going to trigger you or your child that's going to undermine rapport. So you're really thinking, when you need to build rapport, you're really thinking about short bursts of no fail fun. When you have good rapport is when you spend the day together. Okay, so questions about emotional rapport and the importance of that.
That was eye-opening for me.
Oh, good,
That was amazing.
good.
I'm going to take that to heart and all of the notes.
Okay,
The chat is clear.
okay, all right. So changing the environment is another tool. So we used a lot of changing the environment where kids were really little, and it was really effective. We called it childproofing. So rather than yell at our kids, or as our parents used to do, slap our hand when we get into the cat food, we moved the cat food until they developmentally had impulse control. And people would say, well, your parents might have said, well, you guys learned because we slapped your hand. No, you really didn't learn. In fact, you might have even learned slower since they slapped your hand. What happened is you finally got to an age at 18 months where you had more impulse control, and your child would have had that impulse control if you'd slapped their hand or not. So changing the environment is a really effective tool. What's too bad about this is that people stopped using it as a really effective tool. So I want people to continue to model and use changing the environment as a teaching tool. So for example, that 10-year-old who didn't get her dirty clothes into the dirty clothes hamper, you might change the environment by putting maybe a basket literally at the bottom of her bed. So when she undresses at night, the basket is right there. She doesn't have to walk down the hallway to the bathroom to put it in, or she's got the visual basket right in front of her that helps her remember to put her dirty clothes in. That's changing the environment. And we change the environment as adults all the time to make our lives more effective and to make ourselves more what I would call probably successful in the outcomes we want. And so I want people to really continue using change the environment. On your map, using changing the environment teaches things like critical thinking, being decisive. It teaches creativity. It teaches prioritizing. It teaches problem solving. There are so many good tools off this list, off your map, that come from changing the environment, and we forget to use that as a teaching tool. Okay, so questions about that?
Chat is clear.
Good. Okay, foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is used for two things. One is because early on it's used because kids do not predict consequence. So we basically have to say to them, when you go to the grocery store, you have to stay in the cart. When you go to grandma's house, you can't go up the stairs. When you are going through Crossing the street, you have to look both ways. We have to foreshadow the behaviors we're looking for because they don't predict consequences. And it gives them the best chance of having a behavior that's acceptable so we don't have to yell at them. We're letting them know ahead of time what the behavior is we're expecting. The other thing that foreshadowing is good for is that it helps kids transition. And transitions are really hard for young children, and they're temperamentally hard for some people. So if you have a child or an adult at any age who struggles with transitions and change, we do a lot of foreshadowing. This is what we're going to do. This is when, this is how, because it makes the transition easier for them. So we would say to our kids at the park, in 5 minutes, we've got to go home for dinner. That basically is saying to them, I'm giving you time to adjust to the idea that you're going to have to transition. And so we use it for transitioning as well. So we do a lot of foreshadowing and should do a lot of foreshadowing up to about 8. And the reason for that is there's a lot of things, activities, experiences that our kids have no life experience. How would they know not to take things off a shelf in a grocery store? We have to foreshadow that. How would they know that they don't have to cry when you drive through a tunnel, that it's going to get dark, 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 then lighter? Because they haven't had that experience. So we foreshadow because they haven't had a lot of life experience. They also struggle with transitions at under the age of 7. So we do a lot of foreshadowing. Then foreshadowing drops off. The mistake that many parents don't understand is that foreshadowing needs to come back again as our kids start to go into adolescence, because then again, they are going to start having experiences that they haven't had life experience to tell them how to manage. So we're going to start using it again. We're going to say, if you go to a party and people are drinking, don't get in the car. If you go to a party and they're going off to college, if you're going to a party, don't take a drink from anyone and let you mix it yourself. It's like we don't have the life experience now to know how to manage certain environments or certain experiences. Now we're going to start foreshadowing again. So we use it a lot in early parenting, and we use it a lot in later parenting. Okay, so questions about foreshadowing. Okay, so pointing out positive options. So we grew up with a lot of, in authoritarian families, a lot of negatives. Don't do this, don't do that, don't. And so it really undermined self-esteem. It undermined optimism when everything was negative. It undermined a sense of competency. It undermined a sense of trust. So there were a lot of tools on this thing that were undermined by using negative options. So a negative option would be don't color on the wall, or don't scribble on, or don't poke the dog with a pencil, or those were all negatives. The other thing that wasn't good about all the negative options was we have several developmental stages, and here's where knowing development interfaces so importantly. We have several developmental stages where people are oppositional. If you use a directive and it's a negative and someone is in an oppositional stage of development, you'll get the opposite behavior you're looking for. So the ages are that are commonly oppositional are 3 is very oppositional, 7 is oppositional, 9 is partially oppositional, 11 is very oppositional, 13 is oppositional, and 15 is oppositional. So if you say to a 3-year-old, don't run to the car, you might as well have said, run to the car. If you say to a 7-year-old, don't carve on the furniture, they can't help but find a little spot underneath that they can carve on the furniture. They're oppositional. So you use what's called a positive option. A positive option would be, rather than say, don't color on the wall, you'd say crayons are for paper. You'd say we're all walking to the car. You're going to use a positive option. Positive options are incredibly, incredibly challenging for people because we just didn't grow up with them. And all the negative options are so entrenched. So the best way to really use positive options is to think of the behaviors that you're dealing with at any particular age or stage. Getting into the refrigerator, coloring, whatever it happens to be, and think of the behaviors you're struggling with and literally structure, write down for yourself 5 positive options rather than a negative response. 5 positive options. And I really want people to understand there is nothing wrong with scripting. It's like scripting means you think ahead of what you might say. Scripting is a really good way of having good sound bites for your kids for teaching. They're also really good because as you script, you're also getting something more integrated into your brain. So scripting is a really good thing to use with positive options. So script out your positive options for any particular behaviors you're struggling with. Okay, so questions about positive options. Okay, focus on solution. So focus on solution. Remember when I said to you, we want to use a lot of logical consequences up to age 7, because we really want kids to be able to learn to predict consequences and start to be more self-directed. And so after that, we want to drop them off because we know it impacts their ability to be creative. We know it impacts their ability to be compassionate. We know that it causes perfectionism. So what we generally replace that with is what we call focus on solution. Focus on solution is like a logical consequence, only we don't consequence, we actually self-correct the behavior. So the logical consequences, say you're a teacher and a child comes in late from recess. A logical consequence would be that they wouldn't maybe be able to go out the next recess, or perhaps they would have to make up that time after school or before school, or before the next recess, or whatever it might be. Yes, it's a logical consequence. And yes, you probably presented it respectfully, ideally, and it was a teaching tool. But as your kids get older, what we're really looking for is we're looking for behaviors that make them more self-directed, more self-correcting, more self-assessing, more self-aware. By the time your kids become adults, you want to know those behaviors are in place so that your children you can be sure that they are going to self-correct behaviors before it gets them into trouble or causes a problem. So a focus on solution would look like, instead, you would say to the child, what kept you from getting in on time? They may say, I didn't hear the bell. They may say, I got caught up in my activity. They may say, let's just start with those 2. So you'd say you didn't hear the bell. So what could we do? The question would go to them. What could you do that would get you in on time next recess? And they may say, well, I could have a buddy, tap me on the shoulder to tell me it's time. They could say, If they have a watch, they could say, I could set my timer. They could say, well, it would help if somebody would have a visual flag or something. And you say, okay, so which one are you going to use? And they'll say, well, I want the buddy. I'm going to have the buddy tap me on the shoulder. So that's it. The next recess, if they come in on time, there is no consequencing. There's no punishment. If they self-correct that behavior, then they've learned what you want them to learn. So this is a really important tool that after age 8, I want people to use more and more and more. And by the time your kids are in high school, it's going to be one of your primary tools, because you want to know that they are self-aware, they're self-assessing their behavior, they're self-correcting their behavior before they leave your home. So we're going to be doing a lot more focus on solution as the options, one of the options, than we are logical consequences the older your kids get. Okay, so questions about any of those techniques, or questions about positive discipline in general?
So far, the chat is clear.
Okay, any other questions? You still have a couple minutes if you have any questions.
I was just curious myself, Candace, in the sense of some of the topics that were talked about were for the younger children, or younger students. My daughter is 12.
So you're
Would
wondering about some of the teen stuff.
would I believe some of the discipline options you said would fit in, in certain.
Yeah, they still do. If you have a middle schooler, you're kind of in between. And so you would be using some of those options still, or a lot of those options still. So for example, I'm just going to read off to you because I've got it sitting here in front of me. On the discipline for teens list of options, I'll have logical consequences still. I have focus on solutions still. I have reinforcement still. But added to that is giving information. There's a lot of giving information, just learning to do sound bites and a one sentence or two. And so that you're kind of loading kids up, so to speak. There's a lot more modeling in high school, modeling a behavior as a way of teaching versus, punishing or consequencing or whatever. It's like really literally modeling something really different. So for example, just before this, I had a client who was talking about her middle school daughter, and she was saying, should I just have her get off all her social media? And no, she's not on it. She said, so, but should I get off my social media so that it doesn't impact her in a negative way? And I said, no, I honestly don't want you to get off your social media. What I really want is for you to model what it looks like to manage social media in a healthy way. I want you not to see and talk about how many likes or dislikes you get. I want you not to be looking at it 5 times a day. I want you to look at it every once a week or even once a day. So by modeling, you're teaching. Is everybody clear? So that would look really different than you would do with a really younger child. You do a lot more delegating and asking them to use other resources when they're older. So for example, if a child said to you in middle school, what's the temperature today? You would say, hey, you should look online. Why don't you look online? Because you want them to learn to use outside resources. You want them to learn how to get information delegating. So the skills in the second half of your kids' learning that you want them to learn are systemic skills. So you would be doing a lot of things around talking about what everyone in your household is needing on a particular day. I'm going to need you to do dinner because I'm working late tonight. That's learning systemic skills. You would be working on delaying gratification. You would work on all those self skills like self-motivated, self-directed, self-defined. That's why you'd be using a lot of focus on solution. You'd be working on emotional intelligence by that age. You would be doing a lot of repair and recovery, self-correction. So you'd be doing a lot of making amends at that age and modeling making amends. You would be working on social skills at that age and social graces. You would be holding them accountable. You'd be working on accountability tools, which would be checking and holding them accountable to things they said they were going to do. You would be working on resiliency at that age. So there would be a lot of tools that we would use to build resiliency. So as your kids get older, the tools that we would want to be working on would change from some of the basic tools we started with and become more complex so that by the time they hit 25, we felt like we really did have them set where they had the skills and the characteristics they would need to be successful at 25. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. When you talked about amends, just myself raised on how to, but then also to how to teach that with my daughter, that really was super useful, very
Good.
eye-opening.
Good.
Someone shared, Maddie shared that this has been very helpful. Definitely need to practice some of these and grasp these techniques. I agree with Mandy, I'm sorry, I totally pronounced that incorrectly. That they're wonderful techniques, and us, kind of like you had said, raised differently and trying to do things better, that this will take some time for sure, and definitely.
Absolutely, you guys. I mean, this is the piece is that, we've talked about this before. When you think of the continuum of, you know, poor to excellent parenting, it's like you start down on the lower end, even if you're at the lowest end. If you move up and you use one of these techniques that your parents didn't use, you've moved your kids up on that continuum, and that's where they get to start. Is everybody clear about this? You don't have to be a perfect parent. You have to just move up that continuum of function. So if you get really good at one or two of these, your kids are way up on that continuum from where you started. So, and to remind yourself that it literally takes years, literally years to really integrate new behavior. And especially when we have to get rid of all that old stuff that are so entrenched. And so, it takes a lot of self-compassion to continue this process of parenting and teaching, because you have to let go of this idea that you've made a mistake. And so now you might as well just throw it all out with the wash and be done with it. It's like, nope, you get up the next morning and like, I'm going to try a little harder to work on rapport. I'm going to try to be a little less shameful than I was the day before. I'm going to try. After a while, as those become integrated, you don't have to work so hard at it. So trust that if you just hang in there and keep trying, you're going to move up that continuum, and that it's going to get easier over time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I get a possible suggestion on something?
Yeah.
So I have a perpetual issue in the morning with getting ready with the kids, as usual, as everybody has. But like we have the schedule written out with different things that needs to get done at different time frames, and I have a timer, and still, no matter, even though I have everything written out so they don't even have to think, all they have to do is just look at the list. it still doesn't work. My son will just sit there and I'll say, what are you doing? Oh, so
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Okay, so it's really not so much what you're doing wrong as it is that this is a really, like you said, this is such a common problem, particularly in this last generation or two, because um, this is the first generations where we literally generally have two working parents or single parents where one's home and they're trying to get to work or whatever. And so we really do a lot of wishing and hoping around mornings because we're just trying to get out the door ourselves. I mean, we've got to do things and we got to get out the door. In the past, what happened was generally, oftentimes there was a parent at home. And as a result of that, their job was to get kids out the door. That was their job. And their kids habituated to it really early. What we did was we habituated our kids to not get ready. So what we would do is we would try to get ourselves ready. We'd kind of yell, go get your clothes on, you need to eat. We'd be doing these things, but we weren't right there to sort of hold them accountable to it. And so they really never learned to sort of habituate, get up, get dressed, eat breakfast, get out the door. And so you almost have to go back and start like from that place again, where you say to yourself, I'm either going to get up before they do and get ready so I'm available, or I'm just going to wait and get them ready and then get myself ready after we've got them. And for literally weeks, you're going to be, they get up and you're standing right there and you may be helping them even still get their clothes on. You're walking them out to get their food. You're walking them in to get their teeth brushed. You're walking and you do it and you do it and you do it until that behavior is habituated. And the habituation is the thing. It's like people will say, well, I know they know, and I do the list. But the thing is, it's not habituated. We're not any different. We know the list of techniques to use, but they're not habituated yet. So until we use them over and over and over again, then they're really integrated in our behavior. So it's really hard because we've had to really sort of in this last generation undo this idea, because our kids have gotten used to this idea of, well, I can get up, I can kind of fiddle with some toys, I can go to my phone, I can watch TV for a while, I can, and then I'm going to get yelled at because I need to get dressed. And then I'm going to fiddle around, but then they're going to be in getting stuff ready to go out to work. So now I'm going to get yelled at to get my shoes on. So what they learned was I don't really have to habituate this. I just have to tolerate the yelling until we leave.
Well, because what I've noticed is the only way it works is if I literally grab one of their hands, bring them to the counter and say, your vitamins are right here, take them, but I have to stand there. If I walk away,
exactly,
then they don't do it.
Exactly. That is exactly what I'm saying, is that ideally this probably, like I said, would have happened when they were way younger. But we didn't do it that way, this generation, because of the situations we were in. And so they never habituated. So that's one thing you have to kind of start from scratch. It's like literally do that. I know that sounds ridiculous to think, like, why would I do that with a 9-year-old? Why do I have to do that? For the same reason that some of you are doing that with partners at 35 to pick up their socks, because they never habituated picking up their socks, and putting them in. And so don't feel bad.
Yeah, pre-COVID. We had kind of gotten it dialed in and we had, a busy schedule, but actually things functioned better. But then we got used to not having
That's
that and
probably really true. I think that probably is actually very true, because we didn't have that same urgency to sort of have those schedules. So that habituation probably got undone.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, but don't feel bad, and don't be shaming about it, because then you're going to get resistance. So just keep reminding yourself, no, I'm going to walk them over. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it until it's back to habituation.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hey, anyone else?
That just made my morning a lot more complicated. I mean, it makes complete sense, and I get it, but okay.
Yeah. But always remember, I mean, this is true of almost everything to do with the teaching piece, is that the work is always a lot at first, but the payoff is very little later. And I think that, if you think, okay, I might have to really work on the habituation in the morning for a few weeks versus to spend the next 8 years flipping around, yelling at your kids because they aren't getting ready. So 8 weeks versus 8 years, take the 8 weeks, you guys.
Okay.
All right, anybody else?
I see that the chat is clear.
Okay, so we good for tonight?
I think so. If nobody has any other questions, comments, just another second. I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, good night, you guys.
Thank you so much. There were so many great things this evening, and thanks for everybody for coming.
All right,
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you so much. Take care, Candace.
Bye.